Our next speaker appeared on the website just by his title. We didn't put his name first, Eric Ben-Arzi. He became famous a few years ago in one of the most interesting outcomes of the 2008 financial crisis. As you remember, 2008, a big financial crisis, $700 billion bailout to a number of US banks, and then a number of investigations to who actually was responsible, who misbehaved, that led to very few, almost no actual convictions. So no one is at fault. It was a big infrastructural problem. Well, in 2011, Eric Ben-Arzi works at Deutsche Bank, the biggest bank out there, and he starts realizing that something doesn't work well with the risk management department that he works for. He goes and starts asking people and tries to understand what's going on, and he gets very confusing answers, which ultimately leads him to contact the whistleblowing hotline and basically suggest that maybe there is a fraud happening in the biggest bank out there, going to SEC and starting a huge investigation that lasted nearly 5 years and led to, a few months ago, a big outcome where Deutsche Bank was found involved in a fraudulent behavior, the size of which we only are now beginning to understand. They were fined a couple of dozens of millions of dollars, and he was offered, as the process goes, a portion of the money, $8.5 million, as courtesy for his efforts to bring down a big fraud. He declines to take the money. And that's when the story became famous. When you heard about the first story of a whistleblower coming out and saying, I was the guy, I was the whistleblower behind the story, and I don't want to take the money because the money doesn't belong to the people who you fined. It belongs to the shareholders. If anything, you should give it back to them. The story has a lot of twists and turns, and we're going to hear in a second about his experience being a whistleblower and really fighting what seems almost impossible, a human against a huge bank. Here's how it looks first.
Former employees accusing Deutsche Bank of covering up billions of dollars of derivative losses during the financial crisis. Deutsche Bank is denying these allegations.
In 2011, here are the headlines that came a few years after. And now, if everything works well, we're going to hear from Eric Ben-Arzi, who's going to tell us a little bit about the story behind this important event. Hi, Eric.
Hi, how are you, Ron?
Very good. Thank you for joining us. So
Thank you for having me.
Start by a simple description of the day you decide to go and call the hotline. How does it feel? Who did you talk to? What were you worried about? How does it look from the point of view of a whistleblower?
So it's really a very frightening moment to call up the hotline because you know your life is not going to be the same after. You feel those butterflies in your stomach. I took my mobile phone. I went away from my desk. I went downstairs. For those of you who know Lower Manhattan, the Deutsche Bank headquarters was at 60 Wall Street, and I was kind of pacing along Wall Street, then Pearl Street. Then once I was on the hotline, I was told to take down a number, you know, the kind of the serial number of the company. Didn't have a pen or paper, so I had to hop into one of the buildings and write it down on a piece of paper that I borrowed from a doorman. So it was really sort of I remember it as being very chaotic and very frightening, very upsetting.
Who did you talk to about that? So I know that you were working there, and you're working in the risk management department. Who of your colleagues knew about the problems, and how did they respond?
So a number of colleagues knew that there was something going on. Nobody had a full picture, except for, it turns out there was another whistleblower who apparently blew the whistle about very similar issues, the same portfolio, possibly the same things, but maybe some other things as well. I'm not familiar with the exact complaint. But of the colleagues that I spoke to, many of them, people at my level, people one level above, were aware of other issues, were aware maybe of this issue vaguely. But there was definitely a sense of general concern and dysfunction within the department, which caused my concerns to be aggravated, caused me to be more concerned, really.
So I know that the world of derivatives is pretty complex, but can you explain to us somehow what was the nature of the problem that you encountered and how did you know that it's something not okay there?
Yeah, so in a nutshell, for those of you who know a little bit of finance, they took this complex derivative, they marked to market half of it, the positive half, and the negative half, they said, we're not marking that to market, we're just going to set it at zero. Or to be more technical, that negative half was a bunch of options, a huge amount of options that they sold on this credit derivative portfolio, and they marked those options at zero. At the height of the crisis, this was worth north of $10 billion by my various estimates. When I was there, it was probably hundreds of millions, maybe $1 billion. It was still very significant when it came to, for instance, setting bonuses or setting the financial health of the bank. Maybe one way to think about it, if you don't know much about finance, is that the bank essentially had like a car dealer that had a parking lot full of these used Kias, and you could argue about the value of a used Kia. Is it worth $1,000, $2,000? But it's certainly a used Kia. You cannot say that it's a brand new BMW. And Deutsche Bank pretended like it had a parking lot full of brand new BMWs, all worth $100,000. So that's in a nutshell what happened there.
So you go there and you realize that there's a lot of Kias there that are valued as BMWs. What do you do first? Did you talk to someone in the company? Did you try to understand what's going on before you actually went to the hotline?
Absolutely, yeah. Before going to the hotline, I really ascertained this. It's a very serious step. So I made sure that I was in a group that was relatively removed from the trading desk and also from the actual finance department where the financial reports officially get signed off. So my initial assumption was that things were nice where a lot of these my department, people in other groups, then there were closer to the portfolio. Then eventually, I became convinced of the actual fraud once I spoke who was responsible directly for those trades, for valuing those trades, and for signing off on the financial reports.
Okay, so you first go to your colleagues and you say something doesn't make sense here, and then you decide that you're gonna not get your answers within, and you call the hotline and you call the SEC. Afterwards, you still worked for Deutsche Bank, so you knew that there's an investigation going on, but you worked there. How does the day look after, when you kind of come back to work every day, knowing that there's something happening behind the scenes?
Well, there's some tension, obviously, with the superiors, but with my colleagues, none of them really knew what was going on. Again, the people, either the chain of compliance, or those people the same. There were some going around. There was the general department, but I would say that was kind of a strange. Some things went on the same, and then there was this big thing that was going on that was really not normal.
Okay.
But in the meantime, I should say that since I was pressing this issue with my management and with compliance, meetings were arranged with other people in the finance department, and so these meetings became increasingly acrimonious. I was accused of trying to bring down the bank. But these are sort of insulated from the rest of the activities, the rest of my colleagues in the department. But yeah, within that smaller, narrower group, there was definitely the investigation was moving forward at the SEC side, and within the bank, the cover-up and sort of the pressure was building up on me.
So you worked there for a number of months while being investigated, while knowing that there's another investigation happening in parallel. At what point were you shown the door and taken out?
So I was fired
We're getting
I asked a position that okay.
Just a second, we're getting a delay. Okay, let's try again. Oh. I can tell what I know of your story while we try to recover. Okay.
Continue. Yeah, sorry.
You're good.
So essentially, once it became clear that I was, once it became clear that I'm not going to shut up, and that I will cooperate with them, showed me the door.
I'm going to repeat just in case, because I know the story, but I'm going to make sure that while they fix the video, or maybe going to lose the video, that you basically stayed there for a few more months and then offered a job in a different, or was competing for a job in a different office in Berlin and was told, no, sorry, there's no more offering, and then you left the job. And if I understand correctly, being fired just before the bonus time in financial companies actually is a signal to other companies that you did something poorly. So you had a pretty hard life afterwards, getting a job and basically keeping the story silent on one hand while knowing that there's like a big strain on your life. How did life look when you leave the job and you know that you're a hero on one hand, but actually no one can know about it?
Life was very difficult after that in terms of continuing it the way it was before. We lived in a large building. We lived in Hoboken at the time, and you know, many of my neighbors were in the finance industry, or you know, either we couldn't talk to them about it. We couldn't really afford the rents anymore, and you know, in Manhattan or Hoboken, just as expensive. We really had to leave. There was, you know, private school for my son. It was just we couldn't really afford that anymore. So really, your life has turned out that happened to you. I know that, you know, it happens to people who aren't whistleblowers as well, and they face the same difficulties. But I think we were going to manage this okay. But you know, I think over the years, you know, life had become more and more difficult, and I was surprised at how difficult it was to find another job. I tried to find a job in tech and the West Coast. That was difficult. In the end, I had to return back to Israel to find a job that was adequate. And here, actually, interestingly, it was easier to find a job than it was in the U.S.
Okay, we're getting the signal good now, so I'm going to keep it. We're debating whether to keep you with video or not, but for now, I think we're good. So we're going to try one more minute of this from this side. So okay, so you're now trying to get a job, but basically everyone is suspicious of a guy who leaves or gets fired from a big bank just before the bonus time, so everyone knows that something is not right with you. You're kind of a toxic person in the financial industry, and you're also in the midst of a huge investigation. Were you paranoid? Were you worried that your phone is tapped, that every van that parks outside your house in the middle of the night could be someone trying to end this investigation? Like, how worried were you as a person going through this particular story?
So there are times when you become a little more paranoid than others. I think when you're tired and stressed, it's easy to become paranoid. I was concerned about the privacy of my mail account and being tapped. So I increased the security of my Gmail account. I tried to have meetings in person rather than by phone when I could. I did look a little more carefully when I crossed the street. But other than that, there's really not much you can do, and the daily life did go on. So you know. But I was careful, especially when we're still in New York. Mm-hmm. I did look, you know, behind my shoulder to see who's watching, who's listening to my conversation, etc.
Okay, so that's phase one of the story, and in theory, everything should work well because you highlighted a big fraud and now it's investigated. But actually, you learned a few years into this that the SEC is about to close investigation. What did you do then, and how did you decide that you're going to actually get involved yourself and make it come back to life when they're about to close it?
So once we learned, or we had credible information that the SEC was going to close down the investigation, that's when I got in touch with the Financial Times. So it became clear that this story has to be opened up and made public. And it was pretty intense work that lasted over several months with a number of top-notch financial reporters, investigative reporters at the Financial Times, who essentially investigated the story. They found the other whistleblower. They found yet another whistleblower who was anonymous, who were unknown to us until that point. And they really were able to confirm the allegations. They brought out a significant amount of new information, of new evidence. So that really turned the investigation around and really, I would say, saved the day from my perspective.
The investigation leads to a big outcome, as we know. Deutsche Bank at some point claimed that they might go solvent, the biggest bank in the world, because of this particular case. Then you get the call that you're actually going to get $8.5 million for your work. How does this day look?
So I would say this. First of all, this is, in a sense, it's my work, but in another sense, this is kind of a strange thing. This whistleblower award, because it's sort of you get it for helping solve a crime. And yeah, that's sort of part of your work, but not exactly. So it feels very strange. I would have much preferred to have Deutsche Bank call me up and say, thank you for helping us. Thank you for doing your job as a risk manager, and thank you for helping us expose this fraud, at least from the new management, and for them to, for instance, to rehire me or to offer me an award of that type or a bonus. That didn't happen. The problem here with the award that the SEC is giving is that it's an award out of a fine that was imposed on the shareholders. Now, in a case of accounting fraud, it's the shareholders who are the victims, and the culprits, the perpetrators, are the management. Management here got away with their bonuses. They retired very wealthy. They did not have to admit to anything. Some of them did not retire. Some of them are still on street, so they could potentially do even more harm. And maybe the worst part of it is that some of these executives, some of the Deutsche Bank executives, are themselves former and current, were themselves during the crime. They were former and future top SEC enforcement lawyers. In other words, the prosecutors, the cops, are also the robbers here. So it felt as though crime. It felt as though I saw a robbery. I called the cops. And guess what? The cops show up, and the cops are just the robbers. And now they're robbing the victim again, the victim being the shareholders. And they're throwing me a few bucks out of the wallet and telling me, basically, here, you're a partner. Here, shut up. If I had taken the money, I wouldn't be talking to you here, because you'd say, well, justice was served. What do you want? And I think justice was not served. I think these fines, especially this particular fine, because it's an accounting fraud. It's not a case where Deutsche Bank defrauded its clients, in which case you could say that the shareholders indirectly benefit through the share price, even if they're not directly involved in the crime. In this case, clearly, the shareholders are the only victims. There's no third party. There are no clients who are victims. It's the shareholders who are the victims. So this is really egregious to me, and I think this is wrong.
So you sit at home. So you're sitting at home at the time in Israel, because that's the only place you could get a job after this kind of elaborate thing, and you get a call. And how does it even work? Like, who calls you? Where were you when the call comes? And did you immediately say, no, I'm sorry, I'm not going to take the money? How did you kind of handle it's not often that we get that $8.5 million over phone for something we did 6 years ago.
I know. So I received a call from, the call was a surprise. It was in the evening. I was here in my apartment with a friend, and the call came out of the blue, and it was the head of the whistleblower office, and he said, "Yeah, this is. We're pleased to announce that we're giving you this award." And I was just very polite. I said, "Thank you very much," and that's it. I didn't. By that point, I already knew. I knew that an award might be coming, and I knew that by then I knew that I was probably going to refuse it. I hadn't. There's always there was still some room to back out because I hadn't announced it yet. But in my mind, I thought that you know, I'm not going to be part of this. This was brewing over several months, really. After they announced the fine, initially I was angry, but I was told, just wait, because you know it's maybe they'll, you know, the executives are going to pay a price at some point. And then I just saw over during here between the announcement fine and the announcement of my award, during that year, I saw the executives one after another depart. Great fanfare and thank you very much for your service. They weren't fired the way I was fired. And I read that some of them were getting jobs in other, you know, in private equity firms. You know, so it was just, to me, it was outrageous that this is happening. And so, yeah, really that's, and you have to also realize, because once I became a whistleblower, I started following the SEC and Deutsche Bank very closely. And I started reading those stories. I read about, there was an internal whistleblower at the SEC who, I read the story as reported by Matt Taibbi back at the Rolling Stone magazine in 2011. And he described another top SEC attorney with another, you know, very credible allegations of misdeeds related to Deutsche Bank, and he revolves into Deutsche Bank, and he became the general counsel there. That's Richard Walker. And he was general counsel all the way, I think, until last year, when I was still there. So I realized that this thing there was a very tight-knit revolving door. This almost looked like a protection racket. And I was, this feeling was building up for years, really. This feeling of outrage. And so, yeah, by the time I got that call, I think that was ready to explode.
So you're highlighting
absolutely.
two different things. One problem, you say, is that the people that you started investigating, the people that were responsible for the problem, by the time the investigation is over, they now run the SEC, they run all the investigations. So this was one problem. And the other one is that the money that you were given is actually the money that the shareholders themselves needed to get back. So two different things that bothered you. Let me ask you one simple question. Where is the money right now? Where does the money go when you don't get it?
Well, that's a very good question. I think it sits in some, there's a congressional fund, I believe, where the money these fines go, and it's awaiting. So, you know, there are other people who are entitled to a share of this money. So my attorneys, they get a percentage, ex-wife, etc. So there's presumably that would be divided out. My share, of course, I'm not going to claim. But I do want to correct one thing. I don't see it as two separate issues. So the issue of this money belongs to the shareholders and the issue of the revolving door, it's the same thing because the executives, because the cops and the robbers are the same thing, the fact that the robbery victim didn't get their money back and the cops are the robbers, to me that's one and the same problem. I would say that if we had only one component of these two components, I probably would have taken the award. It's not that I have anything in principle against the whistleblower award. And it's not like I don't need the money and I would have taken it. It's just that not like this. You know, I don't want, this award is wrong because this fine is wrong. In other cases, I'm sure, you know, I'm more than, you know, any other whistleblower who gets an award, you know, power to them. Good for them.
So I guess you mentioned that it had a pretty significant strain on your life. You had to look for a job. It definitely had an effect on your relationship. It made you leave the country. Did someone call and apologize? Did you hear anything from the people in your team that you know, knew and didn't do anything, people who didn't understand you? Did you get something that kind of makes you feel a little bit better, at least, other than the applause here?
Well, I do get. So what makes me feel better is that I know that I'm fighting the good fight, and during these, you know, during this voyage, these years, I used in fighting corruption, and this fight against corruption, I will thankless it is, especially when you have a society that is, unfortunately, you know, many of the institutions. In the U.S. in particular, I think throughout quote-unquote civilized world, many of our institutions have been co-opted by but that's the thanks that I got. I would have, you know, I'm sad that I didn't get any thanks from the new management at Deutsche Bank. I was hoping that would happen because they were claiming house. That did not happen. I did get thanks from the SEC Office of the Whistleblower, so I should mention that. And I'm thankful for the thanks. It's just that I'm not really happy with the find. But yeah.
Well, I think the people here are pretty impressed. Gauging, you cannot see, I think, everyone, but I think telling you this is like an impressive story. And I think that there's a question in our time: how do heroes look? And I think that you embody that very nicely. Thank you so much for doing this. Thank you. Thank you.